When we hear the word hysteria, it often brings to mind images of uncontrollable emotions, dramatic breakdowns, and perhaps even something a little chaotic. But why is this term so heavily tied to women? Why, for centuries, were women disproportionately diagnosed with this so-called disorder? And how did it come to be viewed as a distinctly female problem? Today, we're diving deep into the history of hysteria, and by the end, you may see how this story is not just about a medical diagnosis, it's about power, control, and how societies have treated women.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Let's begin with the very origin of the word. Hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, which means womb. Yes, from its very roots, hysteria was linked to female biology. The earliest theories of hysteria were based on the idea that a woman's uterus could literally wander through her body, causing a range of symptoms, from anxiety to paralysis. This idea, strange as it sounds, was accepted for centuries. It positioned women's bodies as inherently unstable, as though their biology made them prone to mental and emotional disruption. But here's the real question: why was this condition so often assigned to women, while men, who certainly experienced emotional distress, were rarely labeled as hysterical? Was it really about biology, or was something deeper at play? As we dig into the history, we see that hysteria wasn't just a medical condition, it was a reflection of societal attitudes toward women. In many ways, hysteria became a convenient label to explain behaviors or emotions that society couldn't or didn't want to understand in women. Throughout history, women have been expected to conform to specific roles: silent, obedient, nurturing. But when a woman stepped outside those boundaries, if she expressed anger, sadness, or even passion, those behaviors were often pathologized as hysteria. This is where it gets really interesting. For centuries, women who expressed emotions that didn't fit into societal norms were diagnosed as hysterical. Think about that for a moment. What does it say about a society that views women's emotions as something to be controlled, medicated, or dismissed? Was hysteria just a way for doctors, and by extension, society, to silence women who were seen as too emotional, too assertive, or too independent? As we move through history, we see how the concept of hysteria was used to reinforce gender stereotypes. During the Victorian era, the diagnosis of hysteria reached its peak. Women were seen as more fragile, more susceptible to emotional instability, and more in need of protection or control by men. In many cases, women who were diagnosed with hysteria were confined to their homes or even institutions, cut off from the world and their autonomy. Let's pause for a second. How does that make you feel, knowing that for centuries, women who dared to step outside the narrow confines of societal expectations were labeled as mentally ill? And here's a deep question for you: if hysteria was about silencing women, then what does that say about the power structures in place at the time? Was hysteria really about women's health, or was it about maintaining control over their bodies, minds, and lives? The medical treatments for hysteria were equally telling. Doctors would prescribe everything from bed rest to bizarre treatments like pelvic massages, which were meant to calm women down. These treatments reflected the notion that women's emotional health was directly tied to their reproductive organs. In other words, a woman's mental state wasn't seen as something she could control or understand. Instead, it was something that had to be physically managed, often by men. But here's where things get even more complex. The medical establishment wasn't just enforcing these ideas, it was reflecting the broader cultural anxieties about women's changing roles. As women began pushing for more rights, more independence, and more visibility, society reacted by trying to label them as unstable, irrational, and yes, hysterical. So hysteria wasn't just about individual women, it was about keeping women in their place as a group. What's fascinating is that many of the symptoms attributed to hysteria were the very emotions and behaviors we now recognize as part of normal human experiences, especially for those living under the stress and restrictions women faced. Anxiety, sadness, anger, these are not signs of disease, but of life, of reacting to difficult circumstances. And yet women were taught to see these emotions as signs of weakness, as proof that they were somehow broken. I want you to think about this. How many times have you heard women today being dismissed as overly emotional or hysterical when they express strong emotions? Does this legacy of hysteria still linger in the way society views women's emotional lives? And what would happen if we stopped viewing emotions as something to fear or suppress, but instead as valuable expressions of human experience? As we move into the 20th century, we see the slow unraveling of the hysteria diagnosis, but it doesn't disappear completely. Instead, it evolves. With the rise of psychology and psychiatry, hysteria morphed into conditions like conversion disorder and anxiety disorders. These new terms may sound more scientific, but the underlying assumptions often remained the same, especially when it came to diagnosing women. The medical community continued to view women's mental health through a lens of control, often downplaying the impact of societal pressures, trauma, and the very real struggles women faced in their daily lives. But here's the twist: as women gained more freedom and visibility in society, they also began to challenge the very notion of hysteria. Feminist movements in the 1960s and 70s called out the ways in which the medical establishment had pathologized women's emotions and behaviors. They argued that what had been labeled as hysteria was, in many cases, a natural response to the oppression women experienced. Think about that for a second. What if what we call hysteria was actually a form of resistance? What if those women who were diagnosed as hysterical were not mentally ill, but simply responding to the restrictions and expectations placed upon them? This raises a powerful question. If society had allowed women the freedom to express their emotions, desires, and ambitions, would hysteria have even existed as a diagnosis? As we reflect on the history of hysteria, we can't ignore the fact that it was used to justify some of the worst forms of oppression against women. It was used to institutionalize women, to strip them of their autonomy, and to dismiss their voices. And while we may no longer use the term hysteria in the same way, the legacy of this diagnosis lingers. Even today, women's emotions are often viewed with suspicion or dismissed as irrational. So what can we learn from the history of hysteria? Perhaps the most important lesson is that we must be careful about how we label and treat emotions, especially when it comes to women. Emotions are not signs of weakness, they are a fundamental part of being human. And when we dismiss or pathologize them, we not only hurt individuals, we also reinforce harmful power dynamics. As we conclude this first part of our journey into the history of hysteria, I leave you with one question: what would society look like if we embraced emotions rather than feared them as a source of strength and wisdom? Would we have a different understanding of mental health, gender, and power? As we continue this journey, we have to ask ourselves, if hysteria was so deeply tied to the idea of controlling women, how did society, and particularly the medical establishment, use it as a tool to maintain that control? The more we look into it, the more we realize that hysteria wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was a reflection of the power structures in place. And those power structures were deeply concerned with keeping women in certain roles silent, obedient, and restrained. One of the most telling aspects of hysteria's history is how it became a kind of catch-all diagnosis for anything that didn't fit into the narrow expectations placed on women. A woman who was angry, hysterical. A woman who was sad, hysterical. A woman who expressed sexual desire or ambition, hysterical. In many cases, hysteria was simply a way of labeling behaviors or emotions that made society uncomfortable. Let's dive deeper into this. During the 19th century, particularly in Victorian England and the United States, women were expected to be the angels of the house, pure, passive, and dedicated to domestic duties. But the reality of their lives was often far from this ideal. Women faced intense pressures, from the confines of marriage and motherhood to the lack of opportunities for education or meaningful work. They were expected to suppress their desires, their ambitions, and even their emotions. And when they couldn't, when their emotions boiled over, or when they pushed against these restrictions, they were often diagnosed with hysteria. In a way, hysteria became a way to explain away women's dissatisfaction with their roles. Rather than acknowledging that the expectations placed on women were unfair, society turned the blame onto women themselves. If she's unhappy, they said, it's because she's mentally ill, not because something is wrong with the system. But here's something to think about. What if these women weren't ill at all? What if they were simply responding to the immense pressure, isolation, and limitations imposed on them by a patriarchal society? Could it be that hysteria was a symptom, not of individual illness, but of societal dysfunction? The more we examine the history, the clearer it becomes that hysteria was about more than just mental health. It was a way for society to control women who didn't conform. Women who were too outspoken, too ambitious, or too emotional were labeled as hysterical, as if their emotions or desires were a problem to be fixed, rather than a reflection of the deeply flawed conditions under which they lived. In many cases, this diagnosis led to women being institutionalized in mental asylums. Once there, they were often subjected to treatments that were not only ineffective but deeply harmful. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, treatments for hysteria included everything from forced bed rest to surgical removal of the uterus, a procedure known as a hysterectomy. These treatments were based on the false assumption that a woman's emotions were directly tied to her reproductive organs. By controlling her body, doctors believed they could control her mind. But we have to ask, were these treatments really about curing women, or were they about silencing them? By labeling women as hysterical, society effectively stripped them of their agency. Once diagnosed, they were no longer seen as capable of making decisions about their own lives. They were placed under the control of doctors, husbands or fathers, who decided what was best for them. And here's the deeper question: how does this reflect the way society views women's autonomy? If women's emotions and behaviors were pathologized as hysteria, wasn't that a way of denying them the right to express themselves, to define their own experiences, and to seek change? It's also important to consider the role of class in the diagnosis of hysteria. While hysteria was often seen as a condition of middle and upper-class women, it wasn't because lower-class women didn't experience emotional distress. Rather, it was because working-class women didn't have the luxury of being diagnosed. They were expected to work, to care for their families, and to endure hardship without complaint. The diagnosis of hysteria, in a sense, was a privilege of the wealthy. It allowed upper-class women to step outside of their prescribed roles, if only briefly, by claiming illness. But at the same time, it reinforced their dependence on men and doctors, who were seen as the authorities capable of managing their health. This brings us to a crucial point. Hysteria was never really about women's health. It was about control over women's bodies, their minds, and their lives. And it wasn't just men who perpetuated this system. Many women, especially those in positions of relative privilege, internalized these ideas and accepted the diagnosis of hysteria as a way of explaining their own unhappiness. But in doing so, they also accepted the notion that they were powerless to change their circumstances. So here's a question for you. If hysteria was about control, then what happens when women reclaim that control? What happens when women refuse to accept the labels imposed on them, when they demand to be seen and heard on their own terms? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we began to see the seeds of that rebellion. Women like the feminist writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who had been diagnosed with hysteria herself, began to challenge the medical establishment. In her famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, Gilman describes a woman who is confined to her bedroom by her husband, who is also her doctor, as a treatment for hysteria. The story powerfully illustrates the ways in which the diagnosis of hysteria was used to imprison women both literally and figuratively, and it became a rallying cry for women who were tired of being told that their emotions were a problem. Gilman's story, along with the broader feminist movements of the 20th century, helped to dismantle the diagnosis of hysteria. As women gained more rights and more opportunities, they began to push back against the idea that their emotions were something to be controlled by men. They demanded the right to express themselves, to pursue their ambitions, and to define their own lives. And as they did, the diagnosis of hysteria gradually disappeared from medical textbooks. But the legacy of hysteria didn't vanish entirely. Even today, women's emotions are often viewed with suspicion. Women who are angry are labeled as overly emotional. Women who are assertive are called bossy or aggressive. And in many cases, women who speak out about their experiences, whether it's in the workplace, in relationships, or in public life, are dismissed as crazy or irrational in a way. The ghost of hysteria still haunts us, reminding us of how deeply ingrained these gendered expectations are. So where do we go from here? If we've learned anything from the history of hysteria, it's that we need to be critical of the labels we place on people, especially when those labels are used to silence or control them. We need to recognize that emotions are not a sign of weakness, but a valid and important part of the human experience. And we need to continue challenging the systems that seek to pathologize emotions, particularly in women. As we look back on the history of hysteria, we can see it for what it really was: not a medical condition, but a reflection of society's discomfort with women's power and autonomy. And while we may have moved beyond the literal diagnosis of hysteria, the struggle for women's autonomy is far from over.